Chapter 1. The Return of Shadows. The streets of New York pulsed with life, but beneath the surface lay another world, a world of contracts, blood, and secrets. John Wick moved like a phantom through the crowd at Times Square, his black suit blending into the shadows between the neon signs. His face was a mask of determination, but inside him a storm raged. They had taken his dog, the last bond to Helen, and it was an insult he could not ignore. The clock was 20 minutes to midnight when he approached the Continental, the hotel that served as a sanctuary for assassins. The building rose like a Gothic cathedral in the heart of Manhattan, its facade a mixture of elegance and menace. John hadn't set foot here for over a year, but he could already smell polished wood and gunpowder before he even walked in. At the entrance stood Karen, the concierge, with his calm smile and a gaze that seemed to read a man's soul. "Welcome back, Mr. Wick," Karen said with a slight nod. "It has been a while." John gave him a curt nod without slowing down. "Are they here?" "Salon 3, as requested," Karen replied, his voice soft but with an undertone of warning. "Be careful, they are not like the others." John moved on, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Inside the Continental, the air was thick with tension, as if the very walls knew what awaited. He passed assassins at the bar, their eyes following him like predators scenting blood. He ignored them. His focus was on Salon 3, where answers, and perhaps his dog, waited. The door to the salon was heavy, made of dark wood with intricate carvings. John opened it without knocking. Inside sat 3 figures around a mahogany table. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in tailored suits, but their eyes betrayed them, cold, calculating, deadly. On the table lay a small, ornate chest, and beside it a stack of cards with an ace of spades on top. "Mr. Wick," said the woman, her voice smooth as velvet but sharp as a blade. Her dark hair was tied in a strict knot, and a tattoo of a snake wound along her wrist. "I am Valentina. These are my colleagues, Marco and Silas. We represent a new order." John stood still, his hands relaxed at his sides, but ready to draw the weapon hidden under his jacket. "Where's the dog?" he said, his voice low but carrying a dull menace. Valentina smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. "All in due time. First we must discuss a contract. One only you can fulfill." "I'm retired," John said, his eyes narrowing. "Give me the dog or this ends badly." Marco, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, let out a dry laugh. "Retired? You're a legend, Wick." "Legends don't retire, they die." Silas, the silent one, tapped his fingers against the chest. "Open it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "See what's at stake." John hesitated, but curiosity and anger drove him forward. He lifted the lid of the chest. Inside lay a golden key, engraved with the symbol of the high table, and a note with an address, Pier 17, 0300. Beneath the note was a small glass vial filled with a red liquid that looked like blood. "It's not just your dog, John," Valentina said, leaning forward. "It's a debt, one you never paid. The high table hasn't forgotten you, and they've hired us to remind you." John slammed the chest shut. "What do you want?" Valentina rose, her movements graceful yet threatening. "There is a man, an old enemy of the table. His name is Darius Kane. He possesses something they want, a list of all active assassins, their hideouts, their weaknesses. He plans to sell it to the highest bidder. You will find him, take the list, and deliver it to us. Do this and you'll get your dog back, alive." "And if I refuse?" John asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then the dog dies," Marco said, "and we'll come for everything you have left. There's no sanctuary for you anymore, Wick. Not even here." John glanced at the window, where the city lights glittered like a false promise of freedom. He felt the weight of the coin in his pocket, the cold metal against his skin. He had tried to escape, but the world had dragged him back, and now it was time to fight. "I need a weapon," he said at last, his voice hard as steel. Valentina smiled again, this time with a hint of respect. "It's already arranged. Karen has a package for you at reception. But John," she paused, her eyes piercing into his, "Kane is not like the others. He's a shadow just like you, and he knows you're coming." John turned without a word and walked to the door. But before leaving the room, he cast one last look over his shoulder. If the dog has so much as a scratch, You'll wish you'd never met me." As he left the salon, he heard Valentina's laugh, but it was strained, as if she too felt the storm approaching. At reception, Karen awaited with a black bag. Inside lay a Glock 34, a knife with a titanium blade, and a handful of gold coins. John took the bag without a word and stepped into the night. The clock read 01:30. Pier 17 was less than 2 hours away, and John Wick had a debt to settle or a world to burn down. Chapter 2, Hunt in the Night. Pier 17 lay deserted under the cold grip of late night, its old warehouses and rusted cranes casting long shadows in the moonlight. The wind carried the scent of saltwater and oil, and somewhere in the distance, a lone siren wailed. John Wick moved silently along the pier, his black suit blending into the darkness. The Glock rested securely in his hand, its weight an old friend he both loved and hated. In his other hand, he held the key from the chest, its golden sheen glimmering faintly as it caught the light from a broken street lamp. The address on the note had led him here, to a place reeking of treachery and danger. John knew it was a trap. It was always a trap, but he had no choice. The dog was all he had left, and the thought of losing it drove him forward like a fire that could not be extinguished. He had faced men like Darius Kane before, shadows, manipulators, men who lived to pull strings and watch others fall. But John was not like the others. He was Baba Yaga, and tonight someone would pay. He stopped at a warehouse with a rusty metal door, marked by a faded sign. Storage Unit 17B. The key fit perfectly in the lock, and with a dull click, the door opened. Inside it was pitch dark, save for a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a weak, flickering glow across the concrete floor. In the center of the room stood a chair, and on it sat a man. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with gray hair and a suit that looked more expensive than most people's yearly income. His hands were bound behind his back, but his eyes were alert, like a fox waiting for the right moment to flee. "Darius Kane, I presume," John said, his voice low and threatening. He kept the gun trained on the man, but every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The man smiled, a thin, confident smile. "You're quick, Wick, quicker than I expected. But you're not here for me, are you? You're here for the dog." John took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Kane's face. "Where is it?" Kane nodded toward a door at the far end of the room. "In there, but I warn you, John. What you find may not be what you expect." John moved toward the door, gun steady in his hand. He had learned the hard way to trust his gut, and right now it screamed that he was surrounded. As he reached the door, he heard a faint click behind him, the sound of a grenade pin being pulled. He dove aside just as an explosion ripped through the floor where he had stood. Smoke and dust filled the air, and through the chaos he heard fast-approaching footsteps. 4 figures emerged from the shadows, all armed. 2 with automatic rifles, 1 with a machete, and the last with a pair of scythe knives that glinted in the light. They moved like a pack of predators, coordinated and deadly. John rolled behind a concrete pillar just as bullets sliced past his head. He breathed deeply, senses sharpened to a razor's edge. It was time to dance. The first attacker, a man with an assault rifle, came too close. John lunged forward, knocked the weapon from his hands, and drove his knife through the man's chest in a single fluid motion. The second gunman opened fire, but John used the first man's body as a shield, soaking up the bullets, then hurled the corpse into the attacker. Before the man could recover, John fired 2 shots, 1 to the knee, 1 to the head. The machete wielder came next, swinging his blade in a deadly arc. John ducked, felt the rush of air against his cheek, and drove his knife upward through the man's jaw. Blood sprayed, but John was already moving, his body itself a weapon. The last attacker, a woman with the scythe, was faster. She lunged at him, her blades spinning like propellers. John parried with his gun, but one blade sliced through his sleeve, grazing his arm. He growled, hurled the pistol into her face as a distraction, and finished her with a swift flick of his wrist. His knife found her heart. When the dust settled, John stood alone, surrounded by bodies. He was out of breath, blood dripping from his arm, but alive. Kane was gone, the chair empty, the rope on the floor. John cursed under his breath. He had been played. He went to the door Kane had pointed to and opened it cautiously. Inside was a small cage, and in it his dog, trembling but unharmed. John fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he opened the cage and let the dog lick his hand. But in the corner of the cage lay something else, a new note, this time with an address in Chinatown and the words, "The list isn't here, but we're not done with you." John lifted the dog into his arms and stepped back out into the night, his eyes burning with fresh determination. Kane had escaped, but John would find him, and when he did, no trap in the world would be enough to stop him. Chapter 3, Blood in Chinatown. The streets of Chinatown were a labyrinth of light and shadow, where red lanterns cast a warm glow over narrow alleys filled with the scent of fried noodles and incense. But for John Wick, there was no warmth here. He moved quickly, his dog safely hidden in an old army bag slung over his shoulder. His arm ached where the side blade had grazed him, but the pain was only fuel. The address on the note led him to a basement club on Mott Street, a place known among assassins as the Dragon's Nest, an arena where contracts were made and lives taken without a trace. John had been here before, in another time, another life. He knew the place was a hive of betrayal, where every smile hid a knife. As he approached the entrance, an unremarkable steel door tucked behind a sushi stand, two guards stepped forward. One of them, a giant with tattooed arms, raised a hand. "Coin," he said, his voice rumbling like thunder. John tossed him a gold coin without breaking stride. The guard caught it, inspected it, and nodded. The door opened, and the pounding of bass and screams surged out like a wave. John stepped inside, every sense on edge. The club was a cacophony of neon light, smoke, and sweat. Assassins, smugglers, and fixers moved in the shadows, their eyes following him like hungry wolves. At the center of the room stood a raised platform, where a man in a white suit held court. It was Darius Kane, surrounded by bodyguards and admirers. His smile was a razor's edge, and in his hand he held up a small USB drive gleaming in the light. The list. John felt his pulse quicken, but he stayed calm. Rushing in now would be suicide. Instead, he melted into the crowd, his gaze never leaving Kane. He noticed a woman in a red dress moving toward the platform, her steps too fluid to be chance. Valentina. She was here, and that meant the game had changed. John cursed under his breath. If she was involved, this wasn't just a hunt, it was a chess match, and he was a piece at risk of being sacrificed. Suddenly, the music cut off, and Kane raised his voice. "Friends, tonight is a historic night. This list," he waved the USB, "is the key to freedom or annihilation. To the highest bidder it goes, and I promise the price will be blood." The crowd erupted in cheers, but John caught movement in the corner of his eye. 4 men, all armed, were closing in from different sides. They weren't Kane's men. The subtle insignia on their lapels marked them as belonging to the high table. Valentina had set him up. This wasn't a deal, it was an execution. John drew his Glock and dove behind a pillar just as the bullets started flying. Chaos exploded in the club. Guests screamed and fled, while assassins drew their weapons and chose sides. John moved like a storm, his shots precise and lethal. The first attacker fell with a bullet to the forehead, the second with a knife to the throat, but the third struck first, his baton cracking against John's shoulder. The pain was blinding, but John spun, broke the man's arm, and finished him with a shot. The fourth was faster, a woman wielding a chain. She lashed it at John's legs, but he leapt clear and hurled his knife. It sank into her shoulder, and she collapsed with a scream. But in the chaos, Kane had vanished, and Valentina now stood on the platform, the USB in her hand. She smiled at John, her eyes full of challenge, before slipping through a back door. John sprinted after her, his dog still safe in the bag. He kicked the door open and found himself in a narrow alley where Valentina waited. She held the USB in one hand and a pistol in the other. "You're stubborn, Wick," she said. "But this is bigger than you. Walk away and maybe you live." John raised his Glock, his voice cold as ice. "Give me the list, Valentina, last chance." She laughed, but before she could answer, a low rumble filled the alley. A black van screeched to a halt, its door sliding open. Kane sat inside, flanked by armed men. "Go," he barked, and Valentina dove into the vehicle just as it sped away. John fired several shots, but the van disappeared around the corner. He stood alone in the alley, breath ragged, bloodied but burning with resolve. The list was gone, but he had seen Kane. He had seen Valentina. And he would find them, even if it meant all of New York would burn. The dog whimpered softly in the bag, and John stroked its head. "We're not done yet," he whispered. The next clue awaited, and he would follow it, even into hell if he had to. Chapter 4, Fire and Ash. New York's skyline glowed at dawn, but for John Wick, the city was a war zone. He had tracked Kane and Valentina to an abandoned shipyard building at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a place where rusty ships and cranes stood as silent witnesses to his hunt. The dog was safe in the Mustang, parked a kilometer away, but John's heart pounded with a mix of anger and determination. The USB drive with the list was the key to his freedom and to ending this. But he knew Kane wouldn't give up without a fight. The building was a labyrinth of corridors and machinery, its metal walls echoing with dripping water and distant sounds. John moved silently, his Glock in one hand and a knife in the other. His injured shoulder throbbed, but he ignored the pain. He had been here before, not in this building, but in moments like this, where every step could be his last. A faint beam of light appeared ahead, and he heard voices. He crept closer and saw Kane standing by a makeshift command center, a laptop, a few monitors, and a map of the city. Valentina stood beside him, her pistol hanging loosely at her side. On the monitors, names and addresses flashed, the list of assassins, their lives exposed like prey. But something else caught John's eye, a cage in the corner, empty. The dog wasn't here. They had tricked him again. "You're late, Wick," Kane said without turning. His voice was calm, but carried an undertone of triumph. "I felt your presence before you even got here. You're predictable." John stepped out of the shadows, gun raised. "Where's the dog?" Valentina smiled, but her eyes were cold. "Safe, for now, but you won't see it until we're done." "Give me the list," John said, his voice hard as steel. "Stop playing games." Kane turned, his face lit by the glow of the monitors. "The list isn't for sale anymore. It's already been sold to someone who pays better than the high table. But you, John, you're a bonus. They want you dead, and I'm the man delivering." Before John could respond, the room exploded into chaos. Hidden doors burst open, and a dozen assassins stormed in, mercenaries, not men of the table, but just as deadly. John dove behind a steel beam just as bullets rained down. He moved like a shadow, his shots striking with surgical precision. Two men fell before they even managed to aim, their bodies hitting the floor with a dull thud. A mercenary with a submachine gun got too close, and John hurled the knife straight through his throat. Blood sprayed, but John had already snatched up the man's weapon and opened fire, mowing down three more. Valentina lunged, her side knives flashing in the light. She was fast, but John was faster. He parried her attack, knocked one blade aside, and drove his elbow into her face. She staggered back, but Kane had vanished in the chaos. John gave chase, through a corridor filled with smoke and screams. He heard engines roaring outside and realized Kane was fleeing. When he reached the exit, he saw a black helicopter lifting from the yard's dock, Kane at the controls. But something else caught his eye, a small cage on the ground, and inside it his dog, whimpering in fear. John sprinted forward, but an explosion behind him hurled him to the ground. Valentina had recovered and thrown a grenade. She now stood over him, gun aimed at his head. "You lost, Wick," she said. "It's over." But John wasn't done. In a flash, he flung a loose screw from the ground into her face, distracting her just long enough to roll away and draw his backup knife. He hurled it, striking her hand and forcing her to drop the gun. Before she could recover, John was on her, his arm locked around her throat. "Where's Kane headed?" he growled. She struggled, but his grip was iron. "London," she hissed. "He's meeting the buyer there, but you'll never make it in time." John released her and rushed to the cage, opening it and lifting out the dog. It licked his face, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of relief. But it was short-lived. Kane was gone, and the list with him. London awaited, and John knew the road there would be paved with blood. He rose, the dog in his arms, and cast one last look at the helicopter vanishing on the horizon. "We're not done yet," he whispered, to the dog and to himself. The next battle was already coming, and John Wick would face it with fire in his heart. Epilogue. John Wick stood at the edge of an abandoned pier by the Hudson River, the city's skyline throbbing in the distance like a heart of neon and steel. The dog sat by his side, nose lifted to the wind, its calm breathing the only thing that kept John anchored. His hands, scarred and bloodied, rested on the railing. The Glock was stowed away, the knife cleaned, yet their weight was still there, a reminder of what he was. He had gotten the dog back, burned the list, and left Kane with a warning he wouldn't forget. And yet victory was bitter. Freedom in this world was always temporary. In his pocket lay the Celtic key, a relic from the helicopter in London. It wasn't a gold coin, not an ordinary clue. Its intricate patterns hinted at something older, something even the high table couldn't control. John had seen much in his days, but this key felt like a door to something new, something dangerous. He would follow it, but not now. For now, he was just a man breathing, living against all odds. He pulled out the Polaroid of Helen, taped and crumpled yet still clear. Her smile was like a knife in his chest, but also a fire that kept him alive. "We made it," he said softly, his voice rough with exhaustion. The dog whined and pressed its nose against his leg, and John bent down to scratch it behind the ears. It was a simple gesture, but it grounded him, reminded him why he had fought. The city was never silent, but out here on the pier there was a kind of peace. Sirens in the distance, the river lapping against concrete, the wind carrying both salt and the city's pulse, it all melted together into a moment of stillness. John knew it wouldn't last. Valentina was out there, Kane too, and the key in his pocket was a ticking bomb, but he had survived worse. He was John Wick, and he bowed to no one. He lifted the dog into his arms and walked toward his motorcycle, hidden in an alley nearby. The Mustang would rest, but not forever. He cast one last look at the city, its lights like a challenge, a summons to continue. With the dog safe against his chest, he started the engine, its roar cutting through the night. Wherever the key led, wherever his enemies waited, John would face them. Not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a man who refused to give up.